Number 1. Randy Stair. For the people working the overnight shift, it should have been one of the quietest hours of the day. A mostly empty supermarket in Eaton Township, near Tunkhannock. A few employees stock shelves, cleaning, finishing routine tasks before closing out the night. But just before 1 a.m. on June 8, 2017, that ordinary rhythm broke apart. Authorities said 24-year-old Randy Stair, a longtime Weiss Markets employee, blocked exits, locked the front doors, pulled shotguns from a duffel bag, killed 3 co-workers, and then died by suicide inside the store. Imagine being inside a grocery store you know by heart and suddenly realizing the person creating the danger is someone you worked beside for years. Before that night, Stair did not look like the kind of person most people would expect to be at the center of a mass killing. He lived in Dallas, Pennsylvania, worked at the store for years, and had built a large online presence under the name Andrew Blaze. Online, he posted videos, animation projects, and long personal recordings that investigators later examined closely. The public image was unusual, but not necessarily criminal. He seemed withdrawn, deeply online, and increasingly detached from the real world around him. That contrast is what made the case so unsettling. From the outside, he was a grocery store worker with creative interests. Underneath, investigators said, he had been planning something catastrophic for a long time. As police and reporters began tracing his digital trail, a darker picture emerged. AP reported that Stair had left behind videos and writings filled with despair, anger, and admiration for the Columbine killers. Authorities also linked him to a Twitter account and online files uploaded around the time of the attack. In those materials, he appeared to describe his intent in advance. That detail matters because it changed the story from a sudden breakdown to something more deliberate. This was not treated as a spontaneous workplace dispute that exploded in the moment. It looked instead like a plan he had been building privately while still showing up for work and moving through normal life. Imagine how chilling that feels for the people who had shared shifts with him, unaware that he may have already decided how the story would end. According to Pennsylvania State Police, Stair came in for his overnight shift around 11 p.m. and worked for roughly an hour and 40 minutes before the violence began. During that time, investigators said, he blocked emergency exits and prepared the store so people inside would have fewer ways out. Just before the shooting, he locked the main entrance doors. Then, around 12:50 a.m., he took out 2 pistol-grip shotguns from a bag and began moving through the store. 3 co-workers were killed: Brian Hayes, Terry Sterling, and Victoria Brong. 1 co-worker managed to escape and call 911. That small detail, 1 person getting out, became one of the most important turning points in the entire case. Without it, the timeline might have stayed confusing far longer. The attack itself lasted only minutes, but the way it unfolded made it especially terrifying. Police said Stair fired nearly 60 rounds, also shooting at store property and merchandise after killing his co-workers. Reuters reported that by the time officers arrived, the scene was already over. Stair had died inside the supermarket. There was no standoff, no chase, no arrest. Just silence after a burst of violence in a place built around routine and familiarity. Imagine the first responders walking into a brightly lit grocery store, aisles still standing, products still on shelves, and realizing that an ordinary workplace had become a crime scene almost instantly. That contrast is one reason this case stayed with people. It felt both sudden and deeply premeditated at the same time. Because Stair died at the scene, the investigation focused less on proving identity and more on reconstructing motive, planning, and sequence. Police quickly identified him, connected him to the online accounts, and traced the materials he had posted before the shooting. AP described an online trail that included violent themes and growing frustration with the world. Search warrants and later records also showed investigators looking closely at his videos, writings, internet history, and the store's surveillance footage. In many true crime cases, the central question is who did it. Here, that answer came quickly. The harder question was why someone who had worked in that same store for years decided to turn it into a trap for the people around him. Legally, the case had an unusual shape because there was never going to be a trial. Stair died during the incident, so there were no charges to test in court, no defense arguments before a jury, and no sentencing hearing months or years later. That does not mean the legal side disappeared entirely. Investigators still had to establish the timeline, confirm the victims, document the weapons, and close the case through official findings. But the usual courtroom chapter never came. The finality arrived on the same night as the crime itself. For victims' families, that can create a different kind of pain. There is no trial to sit through, but there is also no moment when a jury formally speaks. The facts become the record, and the record becomes the only resolution available. So, the current status is stark and simple. Randy Stair died at the scene on June 8, 2017, after killing 3 co-workers at Weiss Markets in Eaton Township. The victims were identified as Brian Hayes, Terry Sterling, and Victoria Brong. There was no conviction because the perpetrator did not survive the incident, and the case has remained closed as a murder-suicide investigation. What remains are the findings, the surveillance timeline, the online material he left behind, and the lasting impact on the community that had to absorb what happened inside a familiar local store. What lingers most about the Randy Stair case is how ordinary the setting was. Not a remote cabin, not a dark alley, a supermarket, fluorescent lights, stocked shelves, a late shift that should have ended with people going home. And maybe that is why it stays with people, because it forces you to imagine a place designed for routine suddenly becoming impossible to recognize. A coworker becomes a threat. A normal shift becomes a final one. And the warning signs, when people look back, seem to have been scattered in places most of the real world never thinks to check. Number 2, Cosmo DiNardo. At first, it looked like a missing persons case multiplied by 4. In July 2017, young men in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, began vanishing one after another, and the timing felt too strange to ignore. Families were calling phones that went unanswered. Cars were turning up without their owners. Rumors spread fast across a community that still looked, on the surface, calm and rural. But beneath that quiet landscape, investigators were starting to fear something much worse. Imagine living in a town where one missing person would already be alarming, then waking up to learn that now there are 2, then 3, then 4, and all of them are young men connected by the same small area. Before his name became nationally known, Cosmo DiNardo was the son of a wealthy family in Bucks County, living on property that included a large farm in Soulberry Township. Public reporting after the case described a young man with a history of mental health struggles, drug dealing, and repeated run-ins with police, but no prior conviction that had removed him from everyday life. That background matters because the case did not begin with a stranger passing through town. It began with someone local, someone with access to land, vehicles, and the kind of familiarity that made it easier to arrange meetings without immediately raising an alarm. On the outside, he was just another young man from a prominent family. Underneath, prosecutors would say, he was setting traps. According to prosecutors, the killings unfolded between July 5th and July 7th, 2017. DiNardo used promises of marijuana deals to lure the victims to his family's farm or nearby locations. The 4 victims were Dean Finocchiaro, Thomas Mayo, Mark Sturgis, and Jimmy Patrick, all young men whose families were suddenly thrown into a nightmare of waiting and uncertainty. Authorities later said the killings happened in separate incidents, not one burst of violence. That detail made the case even more disturbing. It suggested repetition, a method, a willingness to do it again after already knowing what the first disappearance would set in motion. Imagine the confidence that would take. Each new meeting arranged while the pressure in the community was already rising. The break in the case came through the kind of detail that initially seemed small. Investigators found that Thomas Mayo's car had been stolen and was being offered for sale. That pointed them back toward DiNardo, who was arrested first on a weapons case and then held on matters connected to the missing men. At the same time, police were executing search warrants on the family farm, using cadaver dogs and heavy equipment as the search expanded. Then the story turned sharply. On July 13, 2017, authorities said DiNardo confessed to participation in the killings and led investigators to Jimmy Patrick's body. Prosecutors said that confession came in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. What had been a tense search was suddenly transformed into one of the most shocking murder cases Pennsylvania had seen in years. As the investigation widened, prosecutors also charged Sean Kratz, DiNardo's cousin, accusing him of helping in 3 of the 4 killings. But DiNardo remained the center of the case. He was the one who, according to authorities, arranged the meetings and then admitted what happened. The bodies of 3 victims were found in a common grave on the Solberry farm under a metal tank, while Patrick's body was recovered separately after DiNardo revealed the location. That sequence gave the case its awful emotional arc. For families, there had been a brief stretch of hope that their sons were still out there somewhere. Then, one by one, that hope was replaced by locations, charges, and the realization that the entire search had been leading back to one property all along. Legally, the case moved toward resolution faster than many expected. Rather than forcing a full trial on all 4 murders, DiNardo entered a guilty plea on May 16, 2018. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and related charges. In return, prosecutors honored the earlier agreement not to pursue the death penalty. That plea was important because it removed uncertainty from the case and spared the families a long courtroom battle over the details. But it also made the facts feel even more final. There was no jury left to persuade, no alternate explanation waiting in the defense case. The defendant himself had admitted responsibility. In cases this devastating, that kind of clarity can still feel hollow because it answers the legal question without ever answering the human one. Why these 4 young men? At sentencing the same day, a judge imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In plain terms, that meant DiNardo would spend the rest of his life in prison. No release date, no realistic second chapter outside custody. Later reporting confirmed that he remained in the Pennsylvania state prison system serving that sentence, including a transfer to SCI Huntingdon in 2020. I did not find any authoritative reporting showing that his conviction or life sentence has been overturned. So, the current status is straightforward. Guilty plea, life without parole, still incarcerated. What lingers about the Cosmo DiNardo case is not only the number of victims, but the rhythm of it. 4 separate meetings, 4 families waiting, 4 young men who thought they were heading into an ordinary deal and never came home. The setting makes it even more haunting. Not a distant wilderness, not a hidden criminal underworld, but a Pennsylvania farm in a community that seemed quiet and familiar. Maybe that is why the case still feels so unsettling. It reminds you that some of the darkest stories do not announce themselves at first. They begin with missed calls, abandoned cars, and a growing sense that something is wrong until suddenly the whole town realizes it has been standing at the edge of a grave all along. Number 3. Ernest Presley. Some killers hide in chaos. Ernest Presley, prosecutors said, created it on purpose. In Philadelphia, between 2016 and 2018, shootings kept leaving behind the same disturbing possibility. Maybe these were not isolated street crimes at all. Maybe someone was carrying them out methodically, for money, and then moving on before anyone could see the larger pattern. By the time federal prosecutors laid out their case, they described Presley not as a man who snapped once, but as a contract killer tied to 6 deaths and 1 attempted killing across 3 years. Imagine living in a city where each new shooting feels tragic on its own, only to later learn several were allegedly connected by the same hand. Before his name appeared in federal court records, Presley was not a public figure. He was a Philadelphia man who, from the outside, did not carry the kind of notoriety that would make strangers instantly recognize him. But prosecutors later described a very different private role. They said he was deeply entangled in violent criminal activity and, in 4 of the killings, acted at the direction of a drug trafficker who wanted rivals and perceived problems removed. That background matters because it changes the emotional shape of the case. This was not presented as a personal feud boiling over once. It was presented as violence turned into a service, something arranged, assigned, and carried out with cold repetition. The killings prosecutors tied to Presley stretched across multiple years and neighborhoods. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office, he admitted responsibility for 6 murders and 1 attempted murder. 4 of the killings, they said, were murder-for-hire jobs committed in 2017 and 2018 in exchange for money. 2 other murders happened in 2016 and 2017. That timeline is what made the case feel so grim. It was not one terrible night followed by an arrest. It was a sequence, a pattern. One shooting, then another, while the city kept absorbing each act as a separate tragedy. Imagine investigators realizing that several seemingly disconnected killings might actually belong to a single continuing story. The most chilling part of the prosecution's version was its logic. Officials said Presley was not simply reacting at the moment. He was selecting targets and carrying out killings with intent, sometimes at the bidding of someone else. Federal prosecutors said one 2018 killing in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Philadelphia's Overbrook section became a major turning point in the investigation. Once authorities connected Presley to that case, they began tying him to earlier shootings as well. That is often how these cases break open, not with one dramatic confession at the start, but with one piece that finally gives detectives a thread strong enough to pull. And once they pulled, prosecutors said, the pattern widened into something much larger. As the investigation came into focus, the image of Presley hardened from suspect to centerpiece. Local and federal authorities worked together, and prosecutors said the evidence showed he had played a role in 6 killings and the attempted killing of a woman. News coverage after his plea described him as a hitman whose shootings were spread across 2016, 2017, and 2018. That 3-year arc matters in storytelling because it creates the unsettling realization that while families were grieving one victim, another attack may already have been forming somewhere else in the city. Imagine being one of those families and learning years later that your loved one's case was not just a local tragedy, but part of a broader chain of calculated violence. The legal process ended up being powerful precisely because it did not go all the way to a contested trial. In September 2022, Presley pleaded guilty in federal court. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder for hire and multiple counts of using interstate commerce facilities in the commission of murder for hire. That plea mattered because it was not a partial acknowledgement or a narrow deal over one incident. Prosecutors said he admitted to committing 6 murders and 1 attempted murder. In a case this large, a guilty plea strips away the usual uncertainty of trial. There is no jury left to convince, no alternate narrative waiting to be tested. The defendant's own plea becomes the center of the legal story. Still, even with a plea, sentencing was where the weight of the case fully landed. On May 16, 2023, U.S. District Judge Eduardo C. Robredo sentenced Presley to 5 consecutive life sentences. Federal prosecutors said the sentence covered his role in murdering 4 victims in Philadelphia between 2017 and 2018 for money alongside the other killings and attempted murder he had admitted. Local reporting described the punishment as effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in prison. And that is really what 5 consecutive life terms means in practice. No realistic path back, no future date hanging on the calendar, no eventual softening of the legal outcome. The court's answer was total and permanent. As for current status, the record is straightforward. Presley is a convicted killer serving 5 consecutive life sentences in federal prison after pleading guilty in 2022 and being sentenced in 2023. I did not find any authoritative reporting that his conviction or sentence has been overturned. So, the clearest verified ending is this. His case did not remain a rumor-filled underworld story or an unsolved cluster of Philadelphia shootings. It ended with admissions in court, formal convictions, and a sentence designed to keep him in prison for life. What lingers about the Ernest Presley case is the idea of murder becoming routine. Not routine for the victims or their families, of course, but routine for the person carrying it out. Prosecutors described a man who could allegedly move from one killing to the next over years, sometimes for payment, sometimes as part of a wider violent world, without the public seeing the full shape until much later. Maybe that is the most disturbing part. Not only the number of lives lost, but the suggestion that several of those deaths were treated like assignments. In a city as large as Philadelphia, people expect violence to come from conflict, anger, or panic. This case suggested something colder: planning, repetition, and a man who, according to the government, turned killing into work. Number 4. Keith Gibson. Some crime sprees feel random until you see the map. Then the pattern starts to harden. In Keith Gibson's case, the violence stretched across Delaware and Pennsylvania in 2021, moving through stores, streets, and early morning routines with terrifying speed. By the time authorities finally caught up to him, Prosecutors said he had left multiple people dead, several others wounded, and 2 states trying to piece together a single story. Imagine hearing about one robbery killing on the news, then another, and slowly realizing the same person may be behind all of them. Before that 2021 spree, Gibson was already known to the justice system. A P and Delaware officials reported that he had previously served about 13 years in prison for a 2008 manslaughter case and weapons charges. He was released, violated probation, was briefly sent back, and then released again in late 2020 and spring 2021, only weeks before the new crimes prosecutors laid out in court. That background gave the later case an extra layer of unease. This was not a man appearing from nowhere. It was someone who had already passed through the system and then, according to prosecutors, returned to violence almost immediately. Imagine being one of the investigators realizing that the person now linked to multiple killings had already been in prison for taking a life once before. The Delaware portion of the case began on May 15, 2021, when prosecutors said Gibson entered a Metro by T-Mobile store in Ellesmere and killed 28-year-old Leslie Ruiz Basilio during a robbery, then stole her SUV and fled. Weeks later, on June 6th, authorities said he killed Ronald Wright in Wilmington during another robbery. Between and around those events, prosecutors said he also attacked and robbed other victims, including Bilal al-Mansouri, who survived and later testified. These were not described in court as chaotic confrontations spinning out of control. They were presented as deliberate robberies in which deadly force was part of the method. Imagine how frightening that makes the timeline feel. Not one desperate act, but a string of encounters in which ordinary work shifts and routine errands suddenly became fatal. At the same time, Pennsylvania investigators were looking at their own killings. AP reported that Philadelphia authorities accused Gibson in 4 additional 2021 murders there, including the killing of his mother, Christine Lugo, a Dunkin' manager, and 2 other men. That is what turned the story from a brutal local case into something much larger. Delaware was preparing one prosecution, while Pennsylvania was building another, both centered on the same man and the same short window of time. Imagine being a detective in one state, thinking you are tracking a single deadly robbery suspect, only to learn another state may have an entire second stack of homicide charges waiting behind yours. The investigation that finally stopped him came together through surveillance footage, forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and a robbery that did not end the way he expected. AP reported that Gibson was arrested on June 8, 2021, after another robbery in Wilmington, and when police took him into custody, he was armed, wearing body armor, and carrying ammunition. Prosecutors later told jurors that video footage, ballistic evidence, stolen property, and witness identifications tied him to the Delaware killings and other violent attacks. In a case like this, the turning point is often smaller than the crimes themselves. It is not always a dramatic confession. Sometimes it is one surviving victim, one camera angle, one vehicle, one piece of evidence that finally refuses to let the suspect disappear again. When the Delaware trial began in 2023, prosecutors focused on 2 killings and a series of related robberies and attempted killings. According to AP and the Delaware Department of Justice, a New Castle County jury found Gibson guilty in November and 2023 on 25 charges, including murder, attempted murder, robbery, weapons offenses, and other counts tied to the 2021 spree. The defense did not persuade jurors that the state had the wrong man. Instead, prosecutors' evidence, especially surveillance and ballistics, carried the case. That verdict mattered because it gave the first formal courtroom answer in a story that had already sprawled across headlines and across state lines. For victims' families, it was the first moment when the larger fear surrounding Gibson turned into a conviction on paper. Then came the sentence, and it was overwhelming in scale. In March 2024, Delaware Superior Court Judge Ferris Wharton sentenced Gibson to 7 life terms plus 296 years in prison after declaring him a habitual offender. Delaware officials said the punishment covered 22 convictions, including murder, attempted murder, robbery, and related charges from the 2021 spree. AP described it as a sentence that ensures he will spend the rest of his life in prison. In practical terms, That is exactly what 7 life sentences means. There is no realistic path back, no future date that changes the shape of the outcome. The court's message was final. Whatever remained unresolved in Pennsylvania, Delaware had already made certain he would never walk free again. As for his current status, that is where the two-state nature of the case matters most. Gibson is now a convicted killer, serving 7 life sentences plus 296 years for the Delaware crimes, while still facing murder charges in Philadelphia, related to 4 additional 2021 killings. AP and CBS reported after sentencing that he was expected to be extradited to Pennsylvania, though no firm timeline had been announced in those reports. So the clearest verified picture is this: convicted and permanently imprisoned in Delaware, with additional Pennsylvania homicide cases still pending rather than resolved. That distinction matters because his story is not a single closed file. It is one concluded case and another still waiting in line behind it. What lingers about the Keith Gibson case is the pace. The crimes prosecutors described happened within weeks of his release, across 2 states, and against people who were simply working, opening stores, or moving through ordinary routines. Maybe that is the most unsettling part. Not only the number of lives shattered, but the speed with which one man, according to prosecutors, turned everyday places into scenes of terror. A phone store, a street corner, a donut shop, a robbery call. The map only becomes clear at the end, and by then, the damage is already spread across far more lives than anyone first imagined. Number 5. Michael Eric Ballard. Some cases are disturbing because of what happened. This one is disturbing because of what happened after prison. Michael Eric Ballard had already been convicted of killing once as a teenager. He had already been through the courts, already served years behind bars, already been given what the system is supposed to offer: punishment, release, another chance. Then, in June 2010, only a short time after getting out, prosecutors said he entered a home in Northampton, Pennsylvania, and killed 4 people in a single rampage. Imagine hearing that someone who had once taken a life was back in the community, and now 4 more people were gone. That is the part that hits hardest. It turns the case from tragedy into a question people never stop asking: how did this happen again? Before the 2010 killings, Ballard's name already existed in Pennsylvania court records. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported that he had pleaded guilty to third-degree murder in the 1991 killing of Donald Richard in Allentown and had been sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. That earlier conviction matters because it shaped everything that came later. He was not an unknown suspect emerging from nowhere. He was a man with a lethal past, someone the justice system had already confronted once. And yet, to the people around him in 2010, he was again moving through ordinary life, seeing people, visiting homes, blending into the same world everyone else was trying to live in safely. That contrast is what gives the story its weight. On paper, he had paid his debt. In reality, prosecutors would say, something far worse was still ahead. The victims in the 2010 case were Denise Merhe, her father, Dennis Marsh, her 87-year-old grandfather, Alvin Marsh Jr., and neighbor Steve Zernhelt, who authorities said came to help after hearing screams. CBS and 6ABC reported that the killings happened on June 26, 2010, inside Merhe's Northampton home. Ballard had once dated Merhe, which gave the crime an especially unsettling intimacy. This was not a random break-in or a stranger passing through. It was someone with a personal connection to at least one of the victims, someone who knew where to go and who would be there. Imagine the scene from the family's point of view. A familiar person at the door, an ordinary day collapsing almost instantly, and then even the neighbor who responded to help becoming part of the same nightmare. The investigation moved fast because the violence left behind a clear trail. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court's opinion on Ballard's direct appeal summarized forensic evidence, including knives connected to the case that contained DNA evidence from Ballard and victim Steve Zernhelt. Police recovered those weapons, and prosecutors argued the physical evidence showed deliberate, intentional killings rather than a sudden burst of confusion. In many true crime cases, investigators spend months trying to identify a suspect. Here, the challenge was less about who and more about proving the full weight of what had happened inside that house. Every piece of evidence added to the same conclusion. This was not one death spiraling into another by accident. It was a sustained attack that kept going from room to room, person to person, until 4 lives were gone. Then came one of the most important turns in the case. Ballard chose not to force a full guilt phase trial. On April 20th, 2011, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder in Northampton County Court. That guilty plea mattered because it removed any real dispute over whether he had committed the killings. The legal fight shifted almost entirely to punishment. CBS reported at the time that a jury would decide whether Ballard should receive death sentences, and that decision would depend on aggravating and mitigating factors rather than on whether he had been the killer. Imagine being one of the victim's relatives in that courtroom. The basic facts are no longer being debated. The only question left is how permanent the punishment will be. During the penalty phase, prosecutors emphasized the number of victims, the brutality of the attack, and Ballard's prior homicide conviction. The defense tried to present mitigating evidence, but it was not enough to persuade the jury away from the harshest outcome available. On May 17, 2011, jurors deliberated for less than 2 hours before sentencing Ballard to 4 death sentences. That speed says something about how decisively the case landed with them. This was not a long, tortured weighing process that stretched for days. The jury heard the evidence, considered the law, and returned with the most severe answer Pennsylvania could give. For the court, this was no longer just a quadruple killing. It was a quadruple killing committed by someone who had already taken a life before. Ballard appealed, as death sentence defendants routinely do. In 2013, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court reviewed the case and affirmed both the convictions and the death sentences. That appellate ruling is crucial because it means the state's highest court examined the penalty phase issues and still let the sentence stand. I did not find any authoritative source showing that those death sentences have been overturned since. So, the clearest verified status is this. Michael Eric Ballard remains convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and remains under 4 death sentences imposed in Pennsylvania after his guilty plea and penalty hearing. What lingers about the Michael Eric Ballard case is the sense of failed warning. This was not a story where everyone says afterward, "No one could have known." The system did know he had been killed before. That is part of what makes the case so hard to sit with. 4 people died in 2010, but the shadow of the case reaches back to the earlier killing too. It forces people to think about release, risk, and the limits of predicting who will harm again. Maybe that is the deepest unease here. Not only that one man was convicted of killing 4 more people, but that the story reads like a second chance, turning into something final for everyone else. Number 6. Miranda Barber. Some cases become notorious because of what happened. Others become even stranger because of what the accused later claimed. Miranda Barber first entered national headlines in Pennsylvania as one half of the so-called Craigslist killing case, accused alongside her husband of luring a man to a meeting and taking his life. But then the story took a darker and far more confusing turn. While sitting in jail, she claimed she had killed more than 20 people across the country as part of a satanic cult. Imagine following a local homicide case and suddenly hearing the defendant describe herself not as a one-time killer, but as a serial predator with victims scattered across several states. That is the detail that made the Miranda Barber case impossible to ignore. Before the case exploded into public view, Miranda Barber was a 19-year-old newlywed living in central Pennsylvania with her husband, Elite Barber. The couple had only recently moved to the state after marrying in North Carolina. From the outside, they looked young, unstable, and unsettled rather than infamous. But prosecutors would later describe a grim private reality behind that image. According to police, the couple placed a Craigslist ad seeking companionship, hoping to draw in a victim. That background matters because it makes the case feel disturbingly calculated from the start. This was not described as a sudden confrontation in a random place. It was presented as a trap designed in advance, using the anonymity of the internet to bring a stranger into their orbit. The victim was Troy LaFerrara, a 42-year-old man from Port Trevorton. Prosecutors said that on November 11, 2013, he responded to the ad and met Miranda Barber near a shopping mall close to Selinsgrove. What he did not know, authorities said, was that Elite Barber was hiding under a blanket in the back seat of the car. Once LaFerrara got inside, prosecutors alleged the plan moved into place. According to Reuters and AP, Elite came up from the back seat and used a cord to restrain LaFerrara while Miranda attacked him. Afterward, police said, the couple dumped his body in an alley in Sunbury. Imagine that sequence from the victim's point of view. A meeting that seemed secretive but manageable, then the sudden realization that he was never stepping into a date at all. He was stepping into an ambush. The investigation began tightening almost immediately because the digital trail was hard to erase. Authorities linked the last call to LaFerrara's phone to Miranda Barber's cell phone, and that connection quickly put detectives on the couple's path. At first, she denied knowing him. Then, as police confronted her with the phone evidence, the story changed. Reuters later reported that Miranda confessed, while the defense fought to suppress that confession by arguing she had repeatedly asked for a lawyer before giving statements. That challenge became one of the early legal flashpoints in the case. It is a reminder that even when the public thinks the facts are obvious, the courtroom still turns on process, rights, and whether key statements will be allowed to shape the outcome. And then came the twist that pushed the case into true crime legend. In a jailhouse interview with a local newspaper, Miranda Barber said she had participated in at least 22 killings in places including Alaska, Texas, North Carolina, and California. She tied those alleged acts to life inside a satanic cult. The claims were dramatic, chilling, and instantly repeated across national media. But here is where the case becomes important to tell carefully. Authorities did not publicly verify those claims. Reuters reported that even her own father called her a liar, and police treated the statements with skepticism, while saying they would check with other jurisdictions. So while those alleged confessions made her notorious, they did not become proven criminal findings in the same way the Pennsylvania case did. That distinction matters. It separates verified murder charges from self-created mythology. Legally, the case narrowed back to what prosecutors could actually prove in court. In August 2014, Miranda and Elite Barber pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and related charges in the killing of Troy LaFerrara. That plea deal removed the death penalty from the case and guaranteed a mandatory sentence of life without parole under Pennsylvania law. Reuters reported that the prosecution originally charged both with first-degree murder, but the plea spared the state the burden of a full capital trial and spared the victim's family a longer courtroom ordeal. In storytelling terms, this is often where a case becomes less sensational and more final. No jury drama, no sweeping defense narrative winning the day. Just a formal admission of guilt and the court moving straight toward punishment. Sentencing came on September 18, 2014. Judge Charles Saylor sentenced both Miranda and Elite Barber to life in prison without the possibility of parole. AP and Reuters both described it as the mandatory outcome tied to the plea. That means the current status is clear and verified. Miranda Barber remains convicted in the killing of Troy LaFerrara and is serving life without parole. I did not find any authoritative reporting showing that sentence was overturned. Just as important, I did not find authoritative proof that her claims of more than 20 other killings resulted in charges or convictions elsewhere. So, the legal record is narrower than the legend surrounding her. She is a convicted killer, yes, but the sprawling serial killer persona she described remains unproven in the public record I found. What lingers about the Miranda Barber case is the split between fact and performance. The verified. Crime was already chilling enough. A young couple, a fake companionship ad, a stranger lured into a car and killed. That alone would have secured the case a permanent place in Pennsylvania true crime history. But then came the bigger, darker claims, and suddenly the story seemed to stretch beyond one alley in Sunbury into something almost mythic. Maybe that is why it still unsettles people, not only because of what she and her husband admitted doing, but because the case left behind a second question that was never answered cleanly. Was Miranda Barber revealing hidden crimes, or building a terrifying identity around the one crime that was already real? Number 7. Hugo Selensky. For years, people in northeastern Pennsylvania whispered about the property before they fully understood the story. A rural yard near Wilkes Barre, buried remains, missing people, and at the center of it all, a man named Hugo Selensky, who seemed to leave investigators pulling at one thread only to find another beneath it. What made the case so disturbing was not just the violence prosecutors described, but the sense that the full truth might always be larger than the charges that finally led to conviction. Imagine hearing that police searching one man's property did not find one body or two, but multiple sets of human remains. At that point, the case stops feeling like a single homicide investigation and starts feeling like a landscape of secrets. Before his 2015 conviction, Selensky had already become a notorious figure in Pennsylvania because of what was discovered on his land in 2003. Authorities said they found the bodies of pharmacist Michael Kurkowski and his girlfriend Tammy Fassett buried behind Selensky's house, along with at least 3 other sets of human remains. That discovery alone would have fixed his name in public memory, but the legal story became even more tangled because not every death on the property led to a conviction. Earlier, Selensky had been tried in connection with 2 other killings linked to charred remains found there. In 2006, a jury acquitted him of one homicide and deadlocked on the other, though it convicted him of abusing the men's corpses. In other words, long before 2015, he was already a man associated with one of the most notorious body disposal cases in the state. The crimes that finally led to his 2015 conviction went back to May 2002. Prosecutors said Selensky and a co-conspirator, Paul Weekly, targeted Kurkowski, who had pleaded guilty in an illegal prescription drug case and was believed to have access to large amounts of cash. According to the prosecution, Selensky had already taken tens of thousands of dollars from Kurkowski in a scam involving fake legal help, then later decided to rob him again when he urgently needed more money. Prosecutors told jurors that Kurkowski and Fassett were bound, that Kurkowski was pressured to reveal where more money was hidden, and that both victims were then strangled with plastic flex ties. Fassett, prosecutors said, was killed simply because she was there. That explanation gave the case its coldest edge, greed at the center, with violence used to clear the path. The breakthrough came about a year later, in June 2003, when Paul Weekly led police to Selensky's property. Investigators arrived while preparations were underway for a graduation party at the home, a detail that has always made the story feel especially surreal. According to testimony later described by the Associated Press, when officers showed up with a warrant, Selensky immediately blurted out concern that they were looking for bodies. Police dug in the rear of the property and found Kurkowski and Fassett buried in a shallow grave. Then they searched further and found additional remains. Imagine standing on a patch of rural ground where a family gathering was supposed to happen, only to realize the soil beneath it is about to turn into evidence. That is the kind of detail that stays with people long after the courtroom closes. Even then, the case did not move cleanly toward one simple verdict. Selensky became the subject of years of litigation, changing charges, and separate trials. The prosecution's star insider witness was Weekly, who pleaded guilty and testified in hopes of improving his own position. The defense attacked him as the true killer and argued that Selensky was being blamed because the bodies happened to be found on his land. That created one of the central tensions of the trial. Jurors had to decide whether Weekly was a credible witness helping expose the truth, or a self-serving accomplice redirecting blame. In complicated murder cases, that kind of testimony can make everything feel unstable. The story seems clear from a distance, but up close, every witness comes with baggage. At the 2015 trial, prosecutors framed Selensky as manipulative, greedy, and violent. A man willing to kill a supposed friend for money and bury the evidence behind his own house. The defense tried to undermine that portrait by pointing to Weekly's shifting accounts and arguing that the government's case depended too heavily on an accomplice with obvious motive to lie. But on February 11, 2015, after more than 11 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury convicted Selensky on 8 of 10 counts, including first-degree murder and robbery in the deaths of Kurkowski and Fassett. For prosecutors, it was a major win after earlier homicide charges in the broader Selensky saga had failed to fully stick. For the victims' families, it was also the first time a jury had formally tied him to the killings most closely associated with the bodies in his yard. The next major question was punishment. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, which meant the case moved into a separate penalty phase after conviction. But the jury ultimately spared Selensky's life. In March 2015, he was formally sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 56 to 120 years on related charges, and that punishment was ordered to run consecutive to a separate 32.5 to 65-year sentence he was already serving for an unrelated home invasion robbery in Monroe County. In practical terms, that meant he would spend the rest of his life in prison even without a death sentence. Sometimes a life sentence feels abstract. In Selensky's case, stacked on top of everything else, it looked final, but the legal story still did not end there. Selensky continued filing challenges, arguing that he deserved a new trial because of ineffective assistance from his lawyers and other alleged errors. Courts kept reviewing those claims for years. In 2023, the Pennsylvania Superior Court denied post-conviction relief, leaving the convictions and sentence intact. That matters because it brings the current status into focus. Hugo Selensky remains a convicted double murderer, serving 2 consecutive life terms without parole for the 2002 killings of Michael Kurkowski and Tammy Fassett. The larger mythology around the bodies found on his property still hangs over the case, but the legally proven core is those 2 murders and the robbery tied to them. What lingers about the Hugo Selensky case is the feeling that the yard became bigger than the courtroom. The law eventually proved 2 killings, and those convictions have been held. But the public memory of the case is tied to something wider. Multiple sets of remains, earlier charges, partial acquittals, and the sense that one property held more darkness than a single trial could ever fully explain. Maybe that is why this case still unsettles people. Not only because Selensky was convicted of killing Kurkowski and Fassett, but because the story forces you to picture investigators digging into ordinary Pennsylvania ground and finding evidence that suggests the criminal truth might be even larger than what the jury was ultimately asked to decide. Number 8. Robert Bowers. On a Saturday, the morning in Pittsburgh, people gathered for worship the way they had countless times before. The Tree of Life building in the city's Squirrel Hill neighborhood was a place of prayer, routine, and community. Then, on October 27, 2018, that ordinary sense of safety was shattered. Authorities said Robert Bowers entered the synagogue during Shabbat services and killed 11 worshipers, while also injuring 2 congregants and 5 responding police officers. It became the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. Imagine arriving at a place meant for reflection and comfort, only to find that the danger is already inside. Before the attack, Bowers was not a celebrity, a political figure, or someone widely known outside his own circles. He was a truck driver from Baldwin, Pennsylvania, and prosecutors later showed that he had filled social media with anti-Semitic and white supremacist rhetoric. That online record mattered because it gave the case a disturbing clarity. This was not treated as a mystery of motive. Federal prosecutors said the attack was driven by hatred of Jewish people, and the charges reflected that, including hate crime counts in addition to murder-related counts. In January 2019, he was charged in a 63-count superseding indictment. The crime itself unfolded quickly, but the emotional shock of it has lasted for years. 3 congregations were using the Tree of Life building that morning when the attack began. Worshippers were elderly, middle-aged, long-time members of the community, people who had shown up for a normal religious service. Prosecutors said Bowers moved through the building and opened fire, while officers responding to the scene were also wounded during the confrontation. Unlike some cases where the facts remain disputed, the core of what happened here was never seriously in doubt. By the time the case reached trial, Bowers' lawyers had conceded that he was the shooter. The central legal battle became not identity, but intent, mental, as state and punishment. That shift made the investigation feel different from many other mass-killing cases. Detectives and federal agents still had to reconstruct the timeline, collect physical evidence, interview survivors, and establish motive, but there was no long public uncertainty about who had carried out the attack. Instead, the government focused on proving that Bowers acted with the required intent for capital punishment and hate crime convictions. Prosecutors also used his own online posts and statements as part of the broader picture of ideology and planning. Imagine being an investigator and realizing that the person responsible had already left behind a digital trail explaining not only who he hated, but why the attack may have been inevitable in his own mind. When the federal trial began in 2023, the legal process turned to 2 questions: guilt and then whether he should be sentenced to death or to life without parole. On June 16, 2023, the jury convicted Bowers on all 63 federal counts. After that came a separate penalty phase, where the defense argued that he suffered from severe mental illness, while prosecutors argued that the scale of the attack, the deliberate targeting of Jewish worshippers, and the injuries to survivors and officers justified the ultimate punishment. That distinction is important. The trial was not mainly about whether he did it. It was about whether the law would treat this as one of the rare federal cases warranting execution. The jury answered that question in August 2023. On August 2nd, it unanimously recommended a death sentence, and on August 3rd, a federal judge formally imposed that sentence. Reuters reported that the ruling made Bowers the first and only federal defendant sentenced to death during Joe Biden's presidency. The Department of Justice described the case as involving 11 congregants killed, 2 congregants critically wounded, and 5 responding officers injured. For the families and survivors, that sentencing phase was not only about punishment. It was the first official moment when the full moral weight of the attack was translated into the harshest sentence available under federal law. As for current status, Bowers remains under a federal death sentence. That sentence was not commuted in the clemency action President Biden took in late 2024, which excluded Bowers along with Dylan Roof and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. More recently, his lawyers have pursued an appeal seeking to overturn the sentence and obtain a new hearing, according to 2025 reporting. So, the clearest verified picture is this. Convicted on all 63 federal counts, formally sentenced to death in August 2023, still on federal death row status, with the case now in the appellate stage rather than complete. What makes the Robert Bowers case linger is not only the number of people killed, but the place. A synagogue during Shabbat services is one of the clearest symbols of peace, continuity, and tradition. The victims were not caught in some chaotic public dispute or random street violence. They were targeted in a sacred space because of who they were. Maybe that is why this case remains so heavy in public memory. It was not only mass killing, it was an assault on a community gathered in prayer, on a routine that should have felt protected by its very purpose. And even after conviction, trial, and sentence, that original fact is still the one that lands hardest. People came to worship, and hatred was waiting for them there. Number 9, Thomas Matthew Crooks. For a few seconds, the whole country seemed to watch the same impossible moment at once. A campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. A former president on stage. Supporters packed into the summer evening air. Then gunfire cracked across the fairgrounds. Donald Trump grabbed his right ear. People dropped to the ground, and panic rolled through the crowd before most of them even knew where the shots were coming from. Authorities later identified the gunman as 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks of Bethel Park, Pennsylvania. One rally-goer, Corey Comparatore, was killed. 2 others were seriously wounded, and Crooks himself died at the scene after being hit by Secret Service counter-snipers. Imagine standing in that crowd, thinking you are attending a loud but ordinary political event, and realizing in an instant that history has just broken open around you. Before July 13, 2024, Crooks was not known to the public at all. Reuters reported that he was a quiet 20-year-old from Bethel Park, had recently graduated from community college, worked an entry-level job at a nursing home, and had no criminal record. People who knew him described someone reserved, rather than openly volatile. That background matters because it gave the case the unsettling shape that so many high-profile attacks carry. The person at the center did not arrive with a public reputation that warned the wider world. He looked, at least from the outside, like a young man still at the beginning of adult life, and that is part of what made the aftermath so haunting. Investigators were not trying to understand a notorious extremist already under public scrutiny. They were trying to explain how someone who seemed so ordinary could climb onto a rooftop and come within inches of killing a former president. The attack itself unfolded fast, but the timeline investigators reconstructed only made it more alarming. According to the FBI and later Senate findings, Crooks got onto the roof of the American Glass Research Building near the Butler Farm Show grounds and fired 8 shots at about 6:11 p.m. Trump was wounded in the ear. Corey Comparatore was killed. 2 other attendees were injured. Within seconds, local and federal law enforcement returned fire, and a Secret Service counter-sniper killed Crooks before he could continue. A later Senate report concluded that the attempt was enabled by a cascade of preventable security failures and communication breakdowns, including missed warnings and poor coordination between agencies on the ground. Imagine how different this story might have been if just one sighting, one radio call, or one decision had connected in time. That narrowness is what gives the case so much of its tension. It was catastrophic, but it also felt terrifyingly close to becoming even worse. What investigators found afterward only deepened the sense that this had been prepared in advance, even if the motive stayed frustratingly unclear. The FBI said its agents completed searches of Crooks's home and vehicle, gained access to his phone, and seized multiple electronic devices. The Bureau also released evidence photos showing the rifle used in the attack and explosive devices found in his car. Early on, that suggested a broader level of planning than a single rash impulse. But planning and motive are not the same thing. That became one of the central frustrations of the case. Authorities could trace what he brought, where he positioned himself, and how he moved. The harder question was why this particular young man chose this particular target on this particular day. In high-profile violence, people often expect a manifesto, a clean ideological trail, some final message that makes the horror legible. In this case, investigators kept finding preparation without finding a satisfying explanation. That gap between evidence and meaning shaped the entire investigation. The FBI initially said the case was being investigated as an assassination attempt and an act of domestic terrorism. Over time, agents conducted extensive interviews, reviewed digital material, and tracked down tips and leads. Reuters reported in July 2024 that the case left behind a pile of mysteries, including no obvious manifesto and no clear public explanation for why Crooks acted. Then, by late 2025, reporting on the Federal Review said investigators had concluded he acted alone and still had not identified a clear motive. That is an important distinction for a case like this. The basic facts became clearer with time. The deeper reason never really did. Imagine being part of the investigative team, holding the devices, the searches, the witness interviews, the ballistic evidence, and still ending up with the most unsatisfying conclusion of all. One person, acting alone, with no motive, you can prove cleanly. Because Crooks died at the scene, there was never going to be a criminal trial. No courtroom cross-examination, no sentencing hearing, no moment when a jury formally declared guilt. That changes the shape of the story. In most major true crime cases, the trial becomes the place where the narrative is tested. Here, the legal process shifted instead toward investigations of security failures, agency accountability, and official reviews of what went wrong. Reuters reported that a Senate committee later faulted the Secret Service for discipline failures after the shooting, and other reporting showed that 6 agents were suspended as a result of the broader review. So while Crooks himself never faced the justice system, the event still triggered a second layer of consequence. Scrutiny of the people and systems meant to stop exactly this kind of attack. The current status, then, is stark. Thomas Matthew Crooks died on July 13, 2024, after carrying out the attempted assassination at the Butler rally. He was never charged in court because he did not survive the incident. The FBI's investigation later concluded that he acted alone, and public reporting has said the Bureau did not establish a clear motive. The criminal case ended at the scene, but the aftermath did not. Federal and congressional reviews continued into 2025, focusing on preventable failures in protection and communication that allowed him to get into position and open fire. That means the final legal record is split in two. The shooter is dead, but the accountability story around the security breakdown kept moving long after the gunfire stopped. What lingers about the Thomas Matthew Crooks case is how quickly a normal political ritual turned into a national trauma. Campaign rallies are noisy, repetitive, almost theatrical by design. People go expecting speeches, applause, maybe protests outside the gates. They do not expect a rooftop gunman, and maybe that is why this case still feels so unnerving. Not only because Crooks came so close to changing American history, but because he did it in a place that looks so open, so familiar, so exposed to the ordinary public eye. A fairground, a summer evening, a crowd looking toward the stage, then a handful of shots, one dead father in the audience, a wounded candidate, and a young man on a roof whose final answer to the world may remain silent. Number 10. Danilo Cavalcante. 9 days after a jury sent him to prison for life, Danilo Cavalcante did something that turned a brutal domestic killing into an international headline. He escaped. Suddenly, a case that had already horrified Pennsylvania was no longer only about what happened in 2021 to Deborah Brandeau. It was also about a convicted killer slipping out of Chester County Prison, vanishing into woods and farm country, stealing supplies, changing his appearance, and triggering a 2-week manhunt that kept entire communities on edge. Imagine hearing that a man just sentenced to life without parole for killing his former girlfriend was no longer behind bars. That is the kind of news that changes the feeling of an entire region overnight. Before the murder and the escape, Cavalcante was not a public figure. Reporting described him as a Brazilian national who was also wanted in Brazil in connection with a 2017 homicide. In Pennsylvania, prosecutors said he had been living with Deborah Brandeau before their relationship ended. That background matters because it gives the case its central tension. This was not a stranger attack in a public place. It was rooted in a personal relationship, the kind of relationship that should have ended with distance, not fatal violence. Authorities later said Brandeau had learned he was wanted in Brazil and had threatened to tell others, a detail prosecutors presented as part of the motive. Imagine being in her position, believing the most dangerous part of the relationship might already be behind you without knowing it was about to become far worse. The killing happened in April 2021 in Schuylkill Township, Chester County. Prosecutors said Cavalcante attacked Brandeau at her home in front of her 2 children. She was taken to a hospital but did not survive. He fled Pennsylvania immediately afterward and was later arrested in Virginia the same day. From the start, the case carried that especially haunting true crime element of proximity. This was not an unknown offender disappearing into the dark after targeting a stranger. It was a former partner, someone already inside the emotional world of the victim, someone who knew exactly where to go. And once police began putting the timeline together, the image that emerged was not of a chaotic argument spinning out of control, but of a deliberate killing followed by flight. When the case went to trial in Chester County in August 2023, the legal process moved quickly. News reports said the jury took only about 15 minutes to convict Cavalcante of first-degree murder and related charges. On August 22, 2023, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus additional time on a weapons count. That alone would have made him one of the most notorious names in recent Pennsylvania crime. But instead of ending there, the story lurched into a second chapter almost immediately. He was still being held at Chester County Prison while awaiting transfer to a state facility. And on August 31st, just over a week after sentencing, he escaped by scaling walls in the prison yard, climbing over razor wire, and dropping from the roof. Imagine the disbelief of the victim's family hearing that the man just sentenced for Deborah Brandeau's killing was suddenly back outside. That escape is what pushed the case from major regional crime story to wall-to-wall national coverage. Authorities said Cavalcante moved through wooded areas, took food and clothing, altered his appearance, stole a van, and at one point armed himself with a rifle taken from a residence. Schools closed, residents locked doors and checked cameras, Longwood Gardens shut temporarily. Search teams used helicopters, thermal imaging, dogs, armored vehicles, and hundreds of officers as the manhunt expanded beyond the prison area. Reuters reported that he was finally captured on September 13th, 2023, after a heat-sensing aircraft detected him and a police dog helped bring the pursuit to an end. Imagine living in Chester County during those 2 weeks. Every rustle outside, every alert on your phone, every police vehicle on a rural road suddenly feels personal. The investigation after? The escape focused on 2 overlapping questions. First, how had a recently sentenced life prisoner gotten out at all? Second, what crimes had he committed while on the run? Reviews found serious security failures at the prison, including the fact that he used the same basic method as a previous escapee. On the criminal side, Pennsylvania pursued new charges tied to the escape and the conduct during the manhunt, including burglary. That distinction matters because it shows how the story split in 2. One part remained the 2021 murder case. The other became a separate public safety crisis that forced the state to explain both how he got out and what it took to get him back. Legally, the murder case is no longer in doubt. Cavalcante was convicted and sentenced to life without parole in August 2023. Then, in August 2024, he pleaded guilty to escape and burglary charges and was sentenced to an additional 15 to 30 years on top of his life sentence. Later reporting also said his prison escape cost him his right to appeal the life sentence because Pennsylvania courts ruled that a motion filed while he was a fugitive could not preserve his appellate deadline. In other words, the attempt to outrun punishment only made the legal outcome more permanent. So his current status is clear. Danilo Cavalcante is serving life without parole for the 2021 killing of Deborah Brando, plus an additional 15 to 30 years for the 2023 escape-related crimes. The manhunt is over, the convictions are in place, and the appeal path on the life sentence has been cut off by the courts. What lingers about this case is the double shock of it. First, the killing itself. A former girlfriend attacked in front of her children in a crime rooted in fear and control. Then the escape, a convicted killer climbing out of prison and turning quiet Pennsylvania towns into the backdrop for a live manhunt. Most cases only get one moment that freezes the public. This one had two, and maybe that is why it stays with people. Because just when the court seemed to have closed the story, Cavalcante forced everyone to relive it in real time, proving that even after a conviction, terror can still find a way back outside.